One battle in 1525 shattered centuries of medieval warfare. Knights who had ruled Europe for generations suddenly became powerless. This is the incredible story of the Battle of Pavia, the day warfare changed forever. In the freezing, mist-shrouded dawn of February 24, 1525, on the flat plains of northern Italy, two worlds stood on the precipice of an ideological and technological abyss. Just outside the ancient brick walls of the city of Pavia, inside the grand, enclosed hunting park of Mirabello, over 30,000 men prepared to slaughter one another for the destiny of Western civilization. On one side stood the undisputed titans of medieval warfare, the French gendarmes. These were not mere soldiers. They were the physical manifestation of a thousand-year-old aristocratic ideal. Clad from head to toe in articulated, hand-forged plate steel, mounted upon massive warhorses bred exclusively for violent shock tactics, and wielding heavy lances capable of splintering solid oak, the French chivalry was widely regarded as the most formidable offensive weapon on earth. To stand before a full-scale French cavalry charge was to invite the wrath of an unstoppable wall of iron and muscle. Yet, emerging through the swirling morning fog, kneeling silently in the mud and wet grass, was an army of a completely different nature. They were the imperial forces of the Holy Roman Empire and the Spanish Empire, serving the young, ambitious Emperor Charles V. Among their ranks were thousands of German mercenaries, the feared Landsknechts, carrying 18-foot wooden pikes, alongside ragged, cold Spanish infantrymen holding primitive, wooden-stocked iron fire. What those men were about to engage in was not merely another territorial dispute over the rich, fertile lands of the Italian peninsula. It was the definitive watershed moment in military history. Within 4 violent, chaotic hours, the centuries-old social hierarchy of feudal Europe, a system built upon the blood, prestige, and martial dominance of armored nobility, would be shattered into dust. The Battle of Pavia was not just a battle, it was the violent birth of modern warfare, the execution of chivalry, and the dawn of the gunpowder era. To understand how King Francis I of France found himself trapped in this muddy death trap outside Pavia, we must first look back at the grand chessboard of 16th-century Europe, a continent consumed by endless dynastic ambition, economic upheaval, and the terrifying onset of military revolution. Arms known as the matchlock arquebus. For over 5 centuries, the battlefield belonged exclusively to the armored knight. Under the feudal contract, land was granted by kings to noble vassals in exchange for military service. War was not the profession of the common man, it was the divine duty and exclusive privilege of the wealthy elite. A single suit of full-plate armor was a triumph of metallurgical engineering, custom-fitted to the wearer's exact dimensions, costing the equivalent of a modern luxury estate. By the early 1500s, the French crown had refined this feudal tradition into the ultimate standing heavy cavalry force, the companies d'ordonnance. The men who filled these ranks were known as gendarmes, literally men-at-arms. They were raised from the high nobility, trained from childhood in the brutal arts of horsemanship, swordplay, and lance combat. When a unit of gendarmes formed up on the battlefield, knee to knee, in a formation known as the N-Hay, they generated kinetic energy that no infantry formation in history had been able to withstand. Their armor, crafted by master armorers in Milan and Augsburg, was so refined that it could deflect heavy crossbow bolts, longbow arrows, and glancing sword thrusts with ease. The French monarchy believed unequivocally that the gendarme was invincible. Their entire strategic doctrine relied upon the overwhelming shock value of this heavy horse. King Francis I, crowned in 1515 at the age of 20, embodied this chivalric spirit completely. Tall, handsome, athletic, and fiercely competitive, Francis viewed himself as the living incarnation of King Arthur or Lancelot. He was a patron of the arts, inviting Leonardo da Vinci to France, but above all else, he was a warrior king driven by a thirst for martial glory. His obsession was Italy. The Italian peninsula during the Renaissance was not a unified nation-state, but a fractured mosaic of wealthy, competing city-states, Florence, Venice, Milan, Rome, and Naples. Italy was the economic engine and cultural heart of Western Europe, bursting with trade wealth, banking houses, and artistic genius. Whichever European dynasty controlled Italy would dominate the entire continent. In 1515, during his very first year on the throne, the young King Francis I marched a magnificent French army across the Alps and won a crushing victory over the Swiss mercenaries at the Battle of Marignano. It was a masterpiece of heavy cavalry shock tactics and field artillery coordination. At Marignano, Francis was personally knighted on the battlefield by the legendary French hero, the Chevalier de Bayard, the knight, without fear and without reproach. Francis was riding high on the pinnacle of chivalric triumph. But across the border, a massive geopolitical juggernaut was assembling, one that would threaten to encircle France and strip the Valois dynasty of its European supremacy. In 1519, the political landscape of Europe was forever altered by the election of a single ruler. Charles V, a young man from the House of Habsburg, inherited an unprecedented empire. Through a series of dynastic marriages, Charles became the ruler of Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, Naples, and the vast, newly discovered territories of the Americas. To top it all off, he was elected Holy Roman Emperor. For King Francis I in France, the rise of Charles V was a nightmare scenario. France was now completely surrounded by Habsburg territories. To the north lay the Spanish Netherlands, to the east, the Holy Roman Empire, to the south, Spain itself. The Italian peninsula became the vital arena where these two behemoths would clash for European dominance. If Francis could hold northern Italy, specifically the Duchy of Milan, he could keep a wedge driven between Charles's German and Spanish possessions. If he lost Italy, France would be choked to death within the Habsburg vice. The diplomatic negotiations broke down instantly. Between 1521 and 1524, war erupted across multiple fronts. Money flowed like water from Italian and German banking houses, funding massive mercenary armies. But war in the Renaissance was changing rapidly. The sheer cost of maintaining armies had escalated dramatically, driven by a quiet, deadly technological evolution that was taking place in the foundries and blacksmith shops of Central Europe and Spain. For centuries, warfare had been dominated by shock and melee combat. But the introduction of gunpowder from Asia, refined by European metallurgists and chemists, was giving birth to a new class of weaponry. Cannon artillery had already proven its worth by battering down the medieval stone castles of the Hundred Years' War. But artillery was heavy, slow to move, and expensive to produce. What the battlefield truly lacked was an infantry firearm, a weapon small enough to be carried and operated by a single soldier, yet powerful enough to punch through thick steel armor at medium range. To fully appreciate the revolution that took place at Pavia, one must understand the mechanics and social implications of early firearms. The arquebus was a smoothbore, muzzle-loading long gun. It measured about 3 to 4 feet in length and weighed between 10 to 15 pounds. Its operation was remarkably simple, yet brutally effective. A soldier would pour a pre-measured amount of black gunpowder down the iron barrel, follow it with a wadding of cloth or paper, and then drop a round lead ball into the muzzle. Using a wooden ramrod, he would pack the charge tightly at the breech. To fire the weapon, the gunner used a matchlock mechanism, a curved piece of iron called the serpentine, which held a slow-burning cord soaked in potassium nitrate. When the trigger was pulled, the serpentine brought the glowing, lit match down into a small pan filled with fine priming powder. The priming powder ignited, sending a flash of fire through a tiny touch hole into the main chamber, detonating the main charge and propelling the heavy lead ball down the barrel at supersonic speeds. Enter the matchlock arquebus. By modern standards, the arquebus was crude. Its effective range was limited to less than 100 yards. It produced dense clouds of foul-smelling white smoke that quickly obscured the gunner's vision. Reloading required up to 24 individual steps and took anywhere from 30 seconds to a full minute. Rain or high humidity could extinguish the slow match, rendering the weapon completely useless. So why was this crude iron tube so revolutionary? The answer lies in two critical factors: penetration power and democratization of lethality. A standard lead ball fired from an arquebus delivered immense kinetic energy upon impact. Unlike an arrow or a crossbow bolt, which relied on mechanical tension, gunpowder expanded with explosive chemical force. At 50 yards, an arquebus bullet could punch directly through a high-grade steel breastplate, crushing bone, tearing internal organs, and driving shattered armor fragments deep into the target's body. More importantly, the arquebus destroyed the traditional social hierarchy of war. To train an elite knight required 15 years of continuous physical conditioning, horsemanship, and martial discipline, funded by immense aristocratic wealth. To train an English longbowman required a lifetime of muscle development from childhood. In stark contrast, an illiterate peasant or a street mercenary could be trained to load, aim, and fire an arquebus in less than 2 weeks. Suddenly, a 50-cent lead ball fired by a peasant standing in a ditch could instantly kill a highborn duke who had spent his entire life mastering the art of war and wearing a fortune in plate armor. It was an appalling, terrifying, and deeply offensive prospect to the noble chivalry of Europe.